Hello, good evening. Welcome back to this third and sadly last installment of our lecture series on pre-modern disability histories, organized by myself and my colleague and friend Jess Bailey, who's here with me, and with the generous support of the Warburg Institute. We're very happy to see so many of you here. After this particular highly anticipated lecture by Bianca Frohne had to be rescheduled, for which we apologize. My name is Felix Jäger. I am talking to you from the Warburg Stroß Library, together with Jess, who is sitting at my side. I am a 35-year-old white man with short brown hair, and I am wearing a blue linen shirt today. I'm currently working as an assistant at the University of Munich. However, until very recently, I was part of the interdisciplinary research group Bilderfahrzeuge, situated here at the Warburg, Hamburg, and Berlin, that inspired me to undertake this exciting enterprise. Before leaving the floor to Jess, who will introduce our distinguished speaker, I would like to point your attention to some accessibility measures that we have been keen to implement. As you will have noticed, we are using the captioning function on Zoom, which sometimes yields mixed results, or you can turn it off and turn it on yourself by using the button at the bottom of the screen. Our speaker will kindly provide descriptions of any visual content. The chat feature on Zoom will be turned off during the lecture, and we ask that you hold your questions and comments until we open the Q&A portion of tonight's event. Ableist and other harmful behavior, of course, will not be tolerated. The audio of the lecture is being recorded and will be made available on the Warburg's YouTube channel. I'm handing over to Jess.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jess Bailey, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm a young white woman with brown hair wearing a black shirt sitting next to Felix. I'm a PhD candidate in the history of art and medieval studies at UC Berkeley, and I'm currently a research fellow at the Paul Mellon Center and Wellcome Collection. As we come to the close of our lecture series, Pre-Modern Disability Histories, it feels meaningful to end with a scholar whose generosity towards early career researchers and support of this topic of study runs deep. Dr. Bianca Frohne is a leading voice in the study of disability in the European Middle Ages and a lecturer in medieval history at Universitat Kiel. Previously, she was a member of the pioneering research group Homo debilis at Universitat Bremen, which has laid a foundation for the study of pre-modern disability in the German-speaking world and beyond. I encourage you all to seek out this research team's forthcoming edited volume titled Pre-Modern Disability History, a Companion. It is an inspiring resource available for pre-order in German and English that will encourage further research across the humanities and provide ways to incorporate this topic into our teaching. Covering material from 500 to 1800, the volume edited by Dr. Frohne and her colleagues compiles research from a staggering 80 scholars, a real gift to the growing field of disability studies. Dr. Frohne received her PhD summa cum laude from Universitat Bremen for research addressing discourses of the body and illness in 15th and 16th century personal letters and family archives. Dr. Frohne's postdoctoral research examines intersections between pain, chronic illness, and disability in the historical record, taking a subtle approach to recovering culturally situated modes of understanding the body and personhood. Alongside numerous publications on medieval disability, including the challenging topic of the so-called monstrous and the wonder book tradition, she's been awarded prestigious postdoctoral positions in Europe and the UK. Dr. Frohne is currently a research fellow with Swansea University, a hub of disability research here in the UK. And she was recently awarded a fellowship by the German Historical Institute in London for her project, Living with Pain in Medieval Europe. Tonight, she will touch upon some of the most intricate epistemological issues both historians and art historians of disability are confronting, the contested status of visibility. We are looking forward to her lecture titled Learning How to See Crip, Non-Visual Cultures of Disability in the Middle Ages. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Bianca Frohne.
Thank you very much, and hi everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to this inspiring lecture series, and thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I feel very honored to be allowed to present my ideas today. To make my presentation accessible, I will show very few images today, and I'm going to describe the images that are shown. However, my way of looking at images is subjective. If you would like me to describe certain aspects in more detail, please let me know. I'm now going to describe myself briefly. I'm a white woman with brown hair up to my shoulders. I'm wearing a black t-shirt. At the moment, I'm speaking from a rented room in London, and I'm sitting at my kitchen table. I'm now going to share my screen. Oops. Today, I would like to talk about possible ways to examine the visual and non-visual cultures of disability in the Middle Ages from a Crip perspective. I have two aims. First, I would like to think about new approaches to medieval imagery that take into account a more diverse range of image production, different modes of perception, and different ways of being, moving, and feeling that translated into images and aesthetic practices. In this regard, I'm interested in finding out if and how these forms can be studied as cultural practices. To this aim, I'm going to refer to Tobin Sieber's concept of disability aesthetics. Second, I would like to discuss how these approaches could allow us to crip traditional approaches in art history and visual studies. So why is it important to study visual and non-visual cultures of disability in pre-modern societies? What can be gained from such an approach, and what are its limitations? Looking back at this lecture series, I think it has become clear that the study of images and material culture is a highly relevant aspect of disability studies and disability history. Disability researchers do not regard ability and disability as fixed categories, but as social and cultural constructs. Images play a central role in the way we understand, talk about, and reproduce disability today. However, it is not always evident where these images and ideas come from and what social and cultural implications they might have, and what sort of worldview they reinforce. Disability researchers Sharon L. Snyder and David T. Mitchell argue that, quote, one of the primary tasks of disability studies is to cultivate media and textual critics who can intervene in the cultural images of disability that influence our responses and ways of imagining human differences. This is a pressing issue. Everyone is exposed to such images, even those who are least aware of the glut of disability portrayals that saturate our environment each day, end of quote. Disability historians are equally aware of this pressing issue and of the importance images of disability have for their own research. All cultures need and produce images. Pictorial representations, among others, can help us therefore to study the multifaceted ways in which disability could be constructed socially and culturally, and how human differences were approached and understood in past societies. However, regarding the Middle Ages and early modern period, we have to account for an additional challenge. Pre-modern societies did not have an understanding or concept of disability in our modern sense. Instead, we find a wide variety of terms, images, and conceptualizations. In this regard, focusing on specific images that we identify as pictorial representations of disabled people based on our own understanding can have troubling implications, especially if we direct our attention to a limited set of visualizations and pictorial tropes. Of course, art historians will always take into account that medieval pictures were often neither meant to be read as naturalistic, nor to give insight into the lived experience of any social group or subsection of society. However, in collecting, assembling, and comparing a limited number of recurrent images, we often can't help but see a certain kind of historical image that informs our views on life of disabled people in the past. Moreover, we often claim to be able to recognize underlying, generalized attitudes towards people with illnesses, impairments, or differently shaped bodies. So far, attempts to approach pre-modern disability history from an art history perspective have often meant to look for visible evidence of disabilities based on modern concepts and categories, sometimes including clinical labels. Among others, art historical studies have so far focused on depictions of disability in representations of the works of mercy and miraculous healings, on manuscript illumination, especially the margins, but also on medical treatises and works of natural history. Printed books and broadsheets depicting so-called wondrous births and differently shaped bodies from the late medieval and early modern period have been studied with great interest, as well as portraits and other individual representations. Based on these valuable studies, it has been pointed out that medieval images of disability, as we understand it, are often found in connection with the figure of the male beggar. Images of people begging for alms can be found on altar pieces, votive images, reliquary containers, amulets, in illuminations, and other devotional picture productions. These figures often appear in a stereotypical way. They are characterized by missing limbs, torn clothes, or attributes such as crutches or makeshift mobility aids. There are a number of saints who are depicted regularly with figures that are recognizable as begging and serve as an iconographic attribute of this specific saint. One famous example is Saint Martin of Tours. Similarly, Saint Elizabeth of Thuringia is usually depicted with one or several persons who beg for food or clothes. I would now like to show an example of this medieval picture tradition that is already influenced by the tendency to aim for a more naturalistic depiction. This painting dates from 1519 and is attributed to the workshop of Lucas Cranach the Elder. Today, it can be found at the art collection at Coburg Fortress or Feste Coburg. The picture shows two women and one man. They are placed in an outdoor setting with a dramatic landscape visible in the background. The woman can be identified as Saints Elizabeth and Magdalene. Magdalene, on the left of the picture, is recognizable by the ointment vessel in her hand. Both women are wearing elaborate headdresses and translucent veils. Their clothes are made of costly materials such as silk, fur trimmings, and pearls. Elizabeth, to the right of the picture, can be identified by a plate of food and a water jug. She is handing a piece of bread to the man who is depicted in a kneeling or sitting position on the ground. The man has his back turned largely towards the viewer. His face is shown in semi-profile. Both of his lower legs are strapped to mobility aids that look like small wooden benches. His legs end at the ankles and are wrapped in cloth. In his right hand, he holds another wooden aid with a handle, presumably to move himself forward on the ground. With his left arm, he reaches upwards to take the bread offered to him by the saintly woman. His lightly colored clothes are dirty and his short hair is unkempt. Patches of hair are missing and his forehead seems to be bruised. He has an upturned nose and starkly protruding eyebrows. His mouth is open, his eyes are directed upwards. The painting creates a visible contrast between the saintly woman and the man receiving alms. They are characterized by their elegant clothes, graceful postures, and mild facial expressions. Meanwhile, the man is positioned on the ground. He looks up at them imploringly, while they gaze benevolently down at him from above. I chose this image because it is, in many aspects, an example of what we expect when we think of pre-modern attitudes towards disability, and especially of pictorial representations of disabled people. However, it also exemplifies some of the problems of the traditional approach towards identifying medieval forms of disability in art history, and specifically in the history of medicine. By labeling the depicted person as disabled, based on their outward appearance, we at least partly replicate the detached, leisurely gaze at the man's body that is already inherent in the picture in form of the two women who look down pityingly at the figure at their feet. The act of staring at disabled people and the types of relationship it constitutes between observer and observed have been described already by Rosemary Garland Thompson. Now, there are good reasons to differentiate between the act of studying a painting and staring at another person, and for art historians, there's often no other way. In order to describe the picture I looked at and talked about the depicted body in detail just a minute ago. However, it is helpful to remind ourselves that this observant, detached gaze at disabled bodies is not only an intrusive act, but also an act of distancing. By looking at bodies, by categorizing and labeling them, we take up the position of observers. Consequently, there is no engagement with varying or different forms of embodiment, because by looking at someone, we cannot look, feel, or perceive according to their worldview and experiences. Medieval paintings and figurative images, such as this example, often leave us no choice but to inhabit this position. With this in mind, I would like to discuss how we could broaden our perspective and how we could go about cripping one-directional ways of seeing on which art history and visual studies are still largely based. The word crip is derived from the degrading and pejorative term cripple, which sadly is still commonly used to describe medieval artworks. In contrast, as Alice Andrews has recently summarized, the term crip is, quote, a redeployment as a social, political, and theoretical agitator, end of quote. At the moment, I am still careful not to use the term crip when I'm talking about persons who are depicted or described in medieval source material to avoid confusion. My usage of the terms crip and cripping is therefore strictly limited to today's perspectives and actions. The term cripping means the following, quote, as a verb form, cripping marks an action that deconstructs the rigid identifier disability and ability to indicate the fluid and constructed character of disability's entanglements with material, social, cultural, and political systems that work to privilege certain abilities over others. Crip theory therefore employs deconstructive gestures in order to resist the exclusion of disability, pain, suffering, and illness, end of quote. So how can we learn how to see crip? While there has been a shift in perspective recently, as this lecture series can attest to, the study of the visual or non-visual cultures of disability is still an under-researched area of disability studies. This is even more true regarding pre-modern societies. Disability scholars have only recently begun to include the pre-modern imagery of disabilities into their thoughts. Furthermore, there have been few attempts to think about how the lived, embodied experiences of disability itself might have contributed to the production of images and pictures, and how resulting images might differ from the often rather generic depiction of disability in figurative representations. Disability researchers and art historians have, so far, largely agreed that what we understand as disabled bodies were considered to be unsightly, repulsive, or even shameful in medieval visual culture. Even more, the depiction of non-normative bodies could be used to denote a status on the margins of society, as well as moral or religious deviance. The most famous examples have been found in images of Christ's Passion and in hagiographical picture series. In these pictorial contexts, torturers, executioners, and onlookers are often visualized as persons with non-normative bodies, gestures, movements, or facial expressions. Consequently, impairments, wounds, dislocations, disproportionate body parts, or ugliness function as references to moral deviance, sinfulness, and rejection of Christian values and beliefs. Furthermore, especially throughout the later Middle Ages and the early modern period, people begging for alms have been depicted more and more regularly with gestures or facial expressions that hint at, for example, greed or depravity. However, can we actually conclude from these visual practices that disability was primarily thought of as the other, as physical and moral deformity, or as a characteristic of social exclusion? To answer this question, it might be helpful to first reflect on the uses and social significance of figurative representations in medieval cultures, and specifically on the role detailed depictions of bodily characteristics had within this context. It is worth pointing out that throughout the early and high Middle Ages, images did not put emphasis on individual bodily features. In cases where illness, impairment, or pain are attributed to individual figures, these are usually denoted by generic gestures, social situations, and attributes, such as lying in bed or carrying crutches. However, with few exceptions, their bodies themselves do appear unchanged. In this regard, it might be worth pointing out that since early Christian times, pictorial representations were regarded as unreliable and a possible cause of misinterpretation. Meaning had to be established by additional information, so that a person or scene could be identified without mistake. Even throughout the later Middle Ages, in some contexts, images were still regarded primarily as references that required textual information. This is also what I found when I studied votive panels of late medieval German shrines. These large panel paintings depict persons who had experienced a miraculous healing. They were exhibited to promote the shrine and its healing powers. These images are sometimes almost incomprehensible without the accompanying text. It is noticeable that impairments and illnesses are often only hinted at, for example, by elements such as crutches or figures showing a slightly bent posture. Rather than focusing on the outward appearance of individuals, miracle panels often emphasize social interaction through figures such as bystanders, friends, family members, or caregivers. These images probably had exemplary character, as they depict mainly social behavior and pious attitudes that were worth emulating. In contrast, visualizations of impairments and illnesses remain vague and nondescript. Against this background, I would like to consider the possibility that, throughout the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, figurative representations of disabled bodies might have been one, but maybe not the most important medium within the visual or specifically non-visual culture of disability. Going forward, I would like to suggest using an open and flexible working concept of disability to study how experiences of and positions related to impairment, long-term illness, lasting pain, and non-normative bodies and minds could have shaped aesthetic practices in pre-modern societies and contributed to the imagery of disability in different ways. This approach is in accordance with recent developments within disability research, in which embodied, lived experiences of disability have been emphasized. More and more, disability is studied specifically as a complex, changeable, and multifaceted way of being. This shift in perspective is also reflected by the emergence of Crip theory and new, more adaptable models of disability. In this way, areas of experience previously excluded from disability studies have come into view, such as chronic conditions and illnesses, but also trauma, pain, exhaustions, grief, or anxiety. By accounting for these experiences, disability researchers have recognized their epistemological value. Disability, in this wider sense, allows us to explore the diverse ways in which we perceive and construct our social surroundings. This is also the starting point of disability theorist Tobin Siebers, whose concept of disability aesthetics I found very helpful with regard to medieval and early modern societies. According to Siebers, we can understand aesthetics as that which is concerned with the body and its affective sphere. With regard to the experience of disability, Siebers suggests that, quote, aesthetics tracks the sensations that some bodies feel in the presence of other bodies, end of quote. Siebers applies the concept of disability aesthetics exclusively to modern and contemporary art. Therefore, I don't want to suggest that we should try to study the visual or non-visual culture of pre-modern societies in terms of or as comparable to modern and contemporary artworks. Nor do I think that we should compare them to the media cultures and aesthetic practices of our time. However, there are two aspects in Siebers' work that I think might also be of interest to the study of the Middle Ages. First, Siebers' understanding of what disability aesthetics encompasses is highly instructive. His attention is not primarily on disability art as such or on the history of disabled artists, nor is he interested in pictorial representations of disabled people in artworks. Rather, he focuses on those works and approaches that make human bodies visible or perceptible in their materiality, their vulnerability, and their permeability, but also those who approach the body as a medium in itself. According to Siebers, these works raise new questions about what it means to be human based on the variability and diversity of the body. He refers, for example, to works that focus on wounds, injuries, trauma, death, and mortality, as well as to those where bodies or bodily materials are used as central elements in artworks and performances. Siebers' main argument is that disability is an essential resource and one of the essential concepts of contemporary art. Second, Siebers' concept of disability aesthetics allows us to investigate how aesthetic practices might have brought about specific forms of knowledge in the pre-modern era, and contributed to the recognition of disability experiences as having epistemological value. Siebers refers to today's experiences of disability, quote, as a body of knowledge that can be used and shared in form of cultural practices. And I quote, modern art embodies the knowledge of what it means to be a disabled person, where disability appears in another form of embodiment, a complex embodiment, the experience of which teaches that disability is affected by environments and is changed by the diversity of bodies, producing specific knowledge about the ways that environment and embodiment mutually transform one another, end of quote. I would like to refer to Siebers' expression of complex embodiment to further examine the complicated relationship between body and image in pre-modern societies. Above all, it should be pointed out that according to the medieval understanding of sensory processes and physiology, the body itself was regarded as an inherently pictorial medium. Human bodies were regarded as malleable material. At the same time, the body's materiality was known as the primary location of imaginative processes. In this respect, the so-called imagination theory is of particular importance. According to this theory, a special part of the brain, the so-called imagination, played a central role in the processing of perceptions and tactile sensations such as physical pain. The imagination also created images of the outside world, as well as those based on memories, dreams, and visions. The images created in the imagination could, under certain circumstances, leave a material imprint within the body or shape its materiality. Even the act of seeing itself was often understood as an active material process. Against this background, the activities of the imagination have been held responsible for the birth of wondrous and non-normative bodies. However, I would like to point to another area of imaginative practices, namely late medieval practices of piety, such as the purposeful imagining of Christ's Passion. The mental practice of putting ideas in front of the inner eyes was meant to further compassionate contemplation. However, in some cases, it also allowed for the deliberate assimilation to a suffering body. Under certain circumstances, these inner images could be materialized by the imagination. In these cases, immaterial images and ideas were thought to have been realized through intensive aesthetic practices. A famous example detailed by André Rocher is Claire of Montefalco, who died in 1308. In her lifetime, while she was meditating on Christ's Passion, she saw a scene in a vision. From that date, she is supposed to have felt a perceptible cross in her heart. After her death, when her body was opened, they found material images of the cross and also some insignia of the Passion materially imprinted in her heart. Against this background, I would like to suggest studying states of illness, wounding, impairment, and pain experienced by saintly women and men, especially mystics, in the later Middle Ages as visual or rather aesthetic practices that required a culturally learned knowledge of what Siebers has called the body and its affective sphere. The notion that the insignia of Christ's Passion could leave visible material imprints on inner organs highlights the interconnectedness between pre-modern concepts of corporeality and image production. These occurrences were rare and were often only discovered after death, for example, during the process of embalming. Nevertheless, we can approach them as culturally significant, as well as widely shared examples of non-normative bodies that were expressly linked to practices of seeing, imagining, and self-fashioning through visualization. Moreover, notions such as the inherent shareability of pain, the instability of bodily boundaries, and the transformative power of shared expressions, emotions, and images were at the center of pious exercises that were also widely practiced among the laity during later Middle Ages. They point to a body of knowledge that extended to disability, illness, and pain, and was understood, among others, as a set of aesthetic practices. Next, and going back to Siebers' expression of complex embodiment, and his observation that disability produces knowledge about the ways that environment and embodiment mutually transform one another, I would like to point to another area of medieval aesthetic practices, namely early and high medieval shrines and burial places of saints. They can be studied as performative settings in which disabled, chronically ill, and pained persons became visible in a specific way. Following Siebes, this allows us to investigate the interconnectedness of environments and varying forms of embodiment. As an example, I would like to refer to one of the miraculous deeds that occurred after the death of St. Cuthbert in 687. These miracle accounts can be found in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. According to Bede, shortly after the saint's death, a man experienced an attack of paralysis that affected him from head to foot on one side of his body. In order to be healed, he prostrated himself in front of the tomb of the saint. At this point, the following happened, I quote, "While he was praying, he seemed to fall into a deep sleep, and as he afterwards used to relate, he felt a great broad hand touch his head where the pain lay. The touch also passed over all that part of his body which had been afflicted by the disease, right down to his feet, and slowly the pain fled and health was restored." End of quote. In this example, the person in question reports what could be understood as a vivid mental image in order to make others understand his experience. However, I would like to suggest that this experience in itself can be understood as an aesthetic practice. At its center is the physical presence and sensory awareness of one's own body, which is only heightened by the reported experience of interconnectedness and dissolving boundaries. To be able to situate the example in disability theory, I would like to refer to Margaret Childrick. She, among others, has pointed out that in modern Western thought, illness, impairment, and disability are defined by corporeal boundaries. Being ill or disabled is implicitly understood as a state of dissolution that has to be overcome. Consequently, health and well-being are constructed as attributes of a subject defined by its boundaries and its consolidation as a unified entity. I think it is fascinating that, in contrast to our understanding of normative and non-normative bodies, medieval bodies were actually regularly characterized by permeability, malleability, and a lack of boundaries. As I have pointed out before when I talked about the concept of imagination, bodies could be penetrated and shaped in their very materiality by sensory perceptions, images, ideas, and emotions. In a way, being embodied in medieval times always meant a form of transformative embodiment. Disability research has for some time dismissed the imagery of chronically ill and disabled people who came to shrines and churches in order to be healed as condescending or even exploitative depictions, and have pointed to today's harmful trope of healing disability or overcoming disability. However, in comparing and carefully studying medieval reports and images, it is possible to focus not on passivity and dejection, but on shared aesthetic practices that might have constituted temporary communities and might have even furthered an understanding of interconnectedness and interdependency among those present. What seems quite evident is that disabled people were thought of as representatives of the community that formed the living body of the church, and moreover, as actively shaping and channeling sacred space by their mere presence. In this regard, diversely shaped bodies, as well as non-normative behavior, were understood as constitutive in this specific setting. Medievalists like Giselle Denis have argued for a long time that the imagery of early medieval miracle stories could have served as role models that might have helped those who visited shrines to modulate their feelings, perceptions, and imaginations. Similarly, Margaret Childrick and Janet Price have emphasized the epistemological value of disability experiences. They point to, quote, "the disintegrity and permeability of bodies, the fluctuations and reversibility of touch, and the inconsistency of spatial and morphological awareness as features that may be experienced with particular force in the disabled body, but they are by no means unique to it. End of quote. Going back to Bede's miracle report, it is noticeable that this form of complex, transformative embodiment that is at the center of the story is dependent on a body that is disabled, ill, or in pain. While I would not claim that the example can be understood as disability affirmation in our modern sense, I still think it is telling that the imagery of disability is used to highlight and visualize what was thought of as a shared characteristic of all human bodies, namely their variability, mutability, and adaptability, but also their inherent openness, incompleteness, and permeability. Additionally, I would like to show you the picture illustrating this miracle story. The image is taken from a manuscript from the late 12th or early 13th century. It is kept at the British Library today. The picture shows a tomb with a pointed roof on top that is made out with gold leaf. In the background, a church architecture is visible, the top of which rises slightly above the painted rectangular frame that encloses the image. The frame is colored in gold as well. The church has a central nave flanked by two aisles. Part of the church architecture at the center of the image form the interior of a shrine, which is recognizable by the lamp hanging prominently within the pointed arch depicted above the tomb. Apart from the lamp, the space between the tomb and the ceiling of the arch is filled out with nothing but gold leaf, denoting the sacred space at the center of the image. In front of the tomb, a figure is lying on their side. One arm is stretched out next to them, the arm is bent at the elbow. The head is resting on the back of the propped up hand. This pose usually denotes sleeping or resting. A large hand is visible, reaching down from just below the upper edge of the tomb. The hand gently touches the sleeping figure's head at the temple. The sleeping figure appears to have their eyes closed, but it is hard to determine because the manuscript pages are somewhat damaged. The body is clad in a floor-length white gown and a reddish cloak. The body appears nondescript and is fully covered by clothes. The picture illustrates the miracle account given by Bede pretty accurately. I chose this picture for today's lecture because to me, as a modern onlooker, it exemplifies the shift in perspective that is, in my experience, necessary for me to be able to crip my way of seeing, and specifically my ways of looking for or looking at disability in medieval and early modern images. What is striking to me when I look at this image is that my attention is not focused on the act of identifying disability or looking at a disabled body. In fact, the body itself is hardly noticeable. Rather, the viewer participates and shares in the perspective of the person visible in the picture. It visualizes a specific form of embodiment as it was perceived, experienced, and reported by that very person. Therefore, their unique form of embodiment is at the very center. What we are looking at is not, in the first place, a representation of a non-normative or defective body. While the body we see in this image is the human body in its inherent vulnerability, incompleteness, and permeability, at the same time, the image draws its effectiveness not from a visible defect, but from an embodied position. Consequently, the interaction between viewer and viewed is not one-sided. It is not our gaze that is directed unilaterally at the body, rather, our perception is being directed and broadened. This way of seeing is reinforced by the fact that the image does not allow for a focused, fixed, or unchanging gaze. We are seeing the sleeping body of the person in the picture, but at the same time, we are seeing what they felt and experienced as if they were awake. The image oscillates between these viewpoints and makes them somewhat obsolete. In a way, we could say that the picture requires a form of engagement that is not so much an act of looking at, but a form of sharing in the body of knowledge that, according to Tobin Siebers, can be taught by disability experiences. If, following Siebers, we understand disability aesthetics as a way of studying, quote, the body and its affective sphere, and the sensations that some bodies feel in the presence of other bodies. This image and the text it accompanies are a good starting point. However, I would also like to point out two limitations. For one, those pictures I showed and described today are figurative images that still privilege a visual approach. Second, the manuscript illumination from the 13th century has been produced in a tradition that is quite different from later artworks that employ central perspective, a more focused unilateral gaze, and very different strategies of visualizing the invisible. Against this background, it would be wrong to conclude that aesthetic practices in earlier centuries were more affirmative of disability than those in the later medieval or early modern period. The pictures I showed and described today are meant to exemplify a shift in our perspective as we approach these images and practices. Furthermore, I would like to argue that in order to approach the visual and especially the non-visual culture of disability, we need to focus on texts as well as on images, but also on spatial environments and their construction, and on material culture, such as everyday objects, mobility aids, or votive offerings. At this point, however, further research is needed to examine these objects, images, spaces, and forms of aesthetic practices over time, and to account for, among others, religious developments, changes in image and media use, and the emergence of new body images. We also need to be careful not to romanticize the Middle Ages in their treatment of disabled people, or to attribute disability affirmation to texts and images that were often rather exclusionary, disparaging, and condescending. In order to proceed, we might also have to reflect further on the significance of seeing and of visuality in art history and visual studies, and try to find new ways to encompass a variety of perceptions and sensations, different ways of being in the world, and different aesthetic practices. To this end, Sieber's concept of disability aesthetics can help us to decenter our own perspective by becoming defamiliarized with our own unquestioned habits of seeing, but also with our knowledge of medieval illnesses and impairments and the clinical labels that we attach to them. Learning how to see Crip could therefore mean to find ways to fundamentally center disability as a form of complex embodiment in art history and visual studies. Finally, it could also mean to firmly establish Crip perspectives as a valuable contribution in itself, and not only as a means to study disability history. Thank you for your attention.